Today on the podcast, we have our next installment in the life of Disney designer Herb Ryman, an episode that includes in its final moments a story about Ryman that likely even deep Disney fans don't know, the heartbreaking story of Ryman's final moments with, or rather near, Walt. But before we get to that, I want to point out that a few days ago, I posted an extra midweek episode about Disneyland's First Christmas. This is a story previously told here on the podcast, but I did want to point out that this year I added a video that presents never-before-seen footage of Christmas 1955, the park's first year, at Walt's Disneyland. Everything from the decorations on Main Street to the short-lived circus parade to the tent city and even the circus itself. That episode is right before this one in your feed, along with a link to that video. But now, let's settle in for the final months in Walt's life, his final projects, and the role, sometimes surprising, that Herb Ryman played in it. This is one of the key moments in Herb Ryman's life, so if you're ready, here we go. The New York World's Fair would run for 2 seasons, the first in 1964 and the second in 1965. But that initial season opened Walt to a larger world. For years he had assumed that residents of the Northeast, more accustomed to museums, live theater, and symphonies, might not warm to the type of Hollywood-infused entertainment produced by WED. But the fair quickly dispelled any such concerns. The fair demonstrated that Disney's designs didn't just speak to a West Coast or Midwest audience, but rather to people who lived across the country, even in cosmopolitan centers like New York. The Disney success there spurred Walt toward another wave of frenzied activity, projects that were far more directed at Disneyland than they were at TV or film. Beyond New Orleans Square and Pirates of the Caribbean, Walt doubled back to old dreams not yet realized. With the success of the Lincoln figure, Walt wanted to revisit his plans for Liberty Street at Disneyland. "We've got Abraham Lincoln," Walt told Ryman. "That's one president. All right, let's have them all." With this, Walt explored designs that Ryman had made 7 or 8 years earlier for an area themed to colonial Boston that presented 2 stage shows. Only back when Ryman first penciled out these drawings, he believed the show figures would be elaborate mannequins capable only of limited movement, such as small turns of their heads or arms. These shows, as they were imagined in the late 1950s, would have been carried largely by dramatic voices, stage lighting, and projected images, much like a sophisticated wax museum. In contrast, some visitors to the New York World's Fair were so fascinated by the new Lincoln figure, they believed it might be a human actor simply pretending to be a piece of engineering. "Well, let's go to work on this," Walt said, nudging Ryman toward a new version of Liberty Street, one that featured multiple animatronic figures every bit as lifelike as Lincoln. The enthusiasm around a renewed Liberty Street only lasted a short time before Walt moved on to other projects. Still, he remained interested in expanding out his park. For the last 4 years, WED had largely been focused on the fair, meaning that Disneyland saw far fewer new attractions than it had during the 1950s. From 1956 through 1959, the park saw 18 new attractions, but from 1960 through 1964, the park only saw 5, the most significant of which were the Tiki Room and the Flying Saucers, a ride where small vehicles floated on a bed of compressed air. For the park's 10th anniversary, Walt wanted to open a new attraction, though nothing in New Orleans Square would be finished by that date. The solution was to build an improved Lincoln figure for Disneyland, which would play in the Main Street Opera House even while the original figure was still on display in New York. The fact that Disneyland had seen so few improvements in the first half of the 1960s spurred Walt on to another wave of major improvements. Though Walt had added individual rides to existing areas of his park, such as the Skyway in Tomorrowland and the Swiss Family Robinson Treehouse in Adventureland, he was often drawn to redesigning entire areas in a single swoop. The first such area to be redesigned had been the back portions of Frontierland, Tomorrowland, which in 1956 had been remade with a mine train, Tom Sawyer's Island, and a new Native American village complete with an outdoor stage. In 1959, he remade the back portion of Tomorrowland with the Matterhorn, the monorail, and submarine voyage. Likewise, he was then redesigning a few acres next to the river as New Orleans Square. But now he wanted to turn his attention to the original section of Tomorrowland, a long thoroughfare that stretched from the hub back to Autopia. He planned to replace or remake nearly everything that existed along this corridor, from the Hall of Chemistry to the Astrojets, removing many early exhibits such as stage sets from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and updating others such as Rocket to the Moon. The project would be called New Tomorrowland. Ryman, as always, would create stunning artwork, lovely paintings that look down on the development from above, with amber sunlight washing the entire space with its late-day brilliance. His bird's eye would show the long, straight track for the People Mover, a new transportation system based on the ride system then used at the Ford Magic Skyway. The painting also showcased a circular two-story dome, which would hold the Carousel of Progress once its run finished at the fair. It also featured a rising silver spire that marked the entrance to a brand new attraction, which would eventually be called Adventure Through Inner Space. Like Liberty Street and a dozen other concepts, Adventure Through Inner Space was an idea that had bounced around WED for years. Plans for various versions of this attraction stretched back to a 1957 ride design called Microworld, in which vehicles shaped like protozoa carried guests into the world of a molecule. At times it was a water molecule, other times it was a synthetic molecule similar to those developed by Monsanto, which was the likely sponsor of the ride. Microworld had been proposed for a never-built science pavilion in Tomorrowland, where it would have existed alongside a time travel experience and an attraction that explored the surface of Mars. Now, nearly a decade later, a revised version of Microworld would be built at the entrance to New Tomorrowland. At WED for months, this project was casually called the Microscope Ride. This was the attraction on which Ryman first focused his time. Ryman created sketches to explore how this ride would be laid out, including sketches that envisioned the pre-show and load areas. The attraction needed a way to visually explain its conceit to guests, a display whereby onlookers could see an illusion of people being miniaturized down into the world of a molecule. Early designs from the late 1950s had ride vehicles entering the back of a miniaturizing machine, a conical tube that narrowed in such a way to suggest that full-size guests entering the tube were then beamed out of its tiny tip in miniature form. But in Ryman's hands, these designs were better stylized. The concept of miniaturizing people was a story popular in early century science fiction, the type of whimsical adventure that existed before science and engineering focused themselves on atomic and hydrogen bombs. As such, Ryman reached back into his youth to identify visual forms that would pair well with this story. His device featured an enormous microscope arranged in reverse, a device that shrunk guests down into the world of a water molecule. Growing up, Ryman had seen many early 20th century microscopes, including a tabletop model owned by his father. Now he adapted the design of that microscope to create a giant device as a visual icon for this attraction, a curved metal arm that extended down from the ceiling to hold a tube and an eyepiece, as well as a large wheel to focus the unit. The tube and conical joints were held together by metal rings. Guests standing in the queue could watch ride vehicles move into the large opening at one end of the microscope tube, and at the other, see tiny ride vehicles emerge as though they were still in the process of shrinking. For this ride, at the age of 55, Ryman found himself being drawn back into the world of his father, with all of its loss and unresolved emotions, the world of science and drawing again twinned together. George McGinnis, who worked on this project, recalled that Ryman based his designs on an antique microscope. His mother, had she been alive, would have found these drawings amusing. She had wanted her son to study medicine and science rather than art and entertainment. Now, Ryman used images of medicine and science to design a new attraction for Walt's Park. In the months that followed, the microscope design would be changed many times, eventually taking on a far more industrial appearance, but for months in 1965, the mighty microscope, visual centerpiece for this attraction, was a close relative to the device once used by Ryman's father. The microscope ride, or adventure through inner space, would be yet another way that Walt explored how the tools of cinema and Hollywood set design could present new topics in his theme park. Already Walt had explored how various lands might represent the world of film and the world of history. With New Orleans Square, he was exploring how these tools could replicate and perfect an American city. In this ride, as guests were miniaturized, they would investigate the realm of science, specifically the structure of a molecule, right down to the oxygen and hydrogen atoms. This was a design question to which Walt was continually drawn. What other categories of knowledge and experience could WED designers explore for a theme park with the tools of Hollywood? But in terms of Walt's life, New Tomorrowland was not the defining project of 1965. Rather, the defining project was the new resort he wanted to build in Florida, a project alternatively called Disneyland East and Project X. The initial project included a new theme park, a lake, an outdoor recreation area, and a few hotels. In Walt's early plans, the hotels would extend the theming of the park. One hotel area keyed to the Wild West, another to turn-of-the-century America, still another to colonial Boston. Though designers at WED weren't involved in land acquisition talks, they were aware of them. But they were also confused as the land plot quickly increased from 10,000 to 15,000 and finally 27,000 acres, a swatch of earth roughly the size of San Francisco. Amongst themselves, WED designers invented ways to explain the enormous purchase. The most popular story involved visual control. Ryman, like all designers, knew that Walt despised the cheap neon jungle that encircled Disneyland. Some of it was pretty ratty and tacky, Ryman said, and Walt had no control over the peripheral property. Visual control might account for 5,000 or even 10,000 acres, but it couldn't account for 27,000 acres, a plot that was roughly 43 square miles. In light of this, employees developed a second theory. Like most Disney employees, Ryman was aware that the company had received massive profits from Mary Poppins, more money than Disney had ever received from a single picture, including Snow White. One popular theory was that Disney needed to reinvest the money to avoid taxes. If Walt didn't have a place to put that money, Ryman said, it would just go to Uncle Sam. Walt wanted to do something with that profit. He didn't know what it could be. But Walt already knew how he wanted to develop the additional land, only he wasn't yet discussing it with those who worked for him. The surprising answer was this: he wanted to make a city. At WED, Imagineers had different areas of specialization. Ryman translated Walt's dreams into wondrous paintings and sketches, but others developed and refined Walt's ideas into workable plans. Some in this group were engineers, others architects. Among this group were John Hench, who had recently begun to master plan non-entertainment projects, and Marvin Davis, who was trained as an architect. To them, Walt turned to explore his plans for this unique city. For the past decade, Walt had seen how he and his designers at Disneyland had created a superior amusement park, a place that offered the public a higher level of enjoyment than they received from similar parks down by the beach. Now Walt wanted to apply WED's design and development procedures to projects outside of entertainment that held a larger civic purpose. One of these projects was the Mineral King Ski Resort, a village in the mountains focused on outdoor recreation rather than amusements. Another was the California School of the Arts, an interdisciplinary college where students could pursue training in music, dance, painting, animation, and film production. Still another was this city. He called it Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, just as he was developing an improved version of New Orleans from the ground up as part of his theme park in California. He now wanted to develop an actual city from the ground up as a model enterprise just down the road from the theme park he planned to build in Florida. Plans for this city were fluid, often changing. As Walt wanted to retain control of the city, he would prohibit land ownership, creating elaborate homes and apartments for rent. It would also be a model city over which he would have ongoing control. His plans were largely inspired by city planners Ebenezer Howard and Victor Gruen. He envisioned a city with a cosmopolitan downtown district. Much like his amusement park, this area would have alcoves with unique themes, though the themes here were related to individual countries. There might be an area themed to France, another to the UK, and so on. At times, Walt imagined the downtown area covered beneath an air-conditioned dome, creating an area that was similar to, but far larger than, indoor malls that were just beginning to appear across the U.S. Circling the downtown district was a greenbelt with open space and parks, then a ring of apartment buildings, followed eventually by a ring of single-family homes. As Walt had been irritated by city traffic for years, he proposed that traffic moving through Epcot would be arranged on a series of underground expressways, while transportation above ground would be largely provided by elevated monorail and people mover systems, leaving large ground areas open for pedestrians. The monorail would take residents from their homes to a nearby industrial park that Walt planned to develop with the aid of America's best companies, creating a strategic environment where ideas from car manufacturers could mix with those from appliance developers and also communication companies in a mutually beneficial way to move forward the whole of American industry. When Ryman was brought on to the Epcot project, his role, as always, was to create highly detailed and inviting paintings that presented Walt's plans in a way that highlighted the uniqueness of the project. For days, Herbie worked on bird's-eye overviews of the city, with its glass and steel hotel rising from its center. His paintings, awash with blues, presented the futuristic city as rising up out of the night, like an image of hope in a sea of darkness. Surrounding the 30-story hotel would be a shopping and dining district. Here, too, Ryman created visuals that defined the mood and feel of the city. In one watercolor, he brushed out a street scene for the Spanish section, with residents out shopping. The architecture was Mediterranean, as was the terracotta-toned walkway. Above it all, passing on a wide overhead track, was the people mover. The final painting mixed together elements of the old and new world. It was the type of watercolor that Ryman had created in the 1930s while touring Europe that used cityscapes to define the cultural identity of a region. Beyond cityscapes, he finished multiple paintings that depicted how transportation would work, some of them cutaway images that showed parked cars in subterranean structures, with residents taking escalators to reach elevated stations for both the people mover and the monorail. These paintings overall were designed to convince American corporations necessary for the Disney-created industrial park that such a city could be a reality, a place that would be as attractive as the images produced by Ryman. In many of his paintings, Ryman positioned the point of view roughly eye level, as though viewers were already standing in this miraculous city, new residents in a world Ryman had created with his brush. During these months, Epcot was Walt's one big love, a growing obsession. With project managers, engineers, and architects, he visited headquarters for large American companies, selling them on the Epcot plan, a place where their best scientists and engineers could work in world-class industrial facilities alongside the best scientists and engineers from other companies. Among the first corporations that Walt visited was Monsanto, the organization that was underwriting the microscope attraction that Ryman had helped develop. On Sunday, July 24, 1966, Walt hosted the opening ceremonies for New Orleans Square. Neither the Haunted Mansion nor Pirates of the Caribbean was finished, nor would they be for some time, so the opening was focused on the shops, restaurants, and outdoor open areas. It was a recreation of New Orleans' French Quarter, particularly the narrow alleys that surrounded Jackson Square, with their elegant balconies and ornate iron railings. For the event, Walt invited Victor Shiro, the mayor of New Orleans, as his special guest. During the ceremony, Mayor Shiro said, "I tell sir, looks just like home." Walt, only half joking, said, "Well, I'd say it's a lot cleaner." Not to be easily upstaged, the mayor replied, "Let's wait 100 years and see how clean it is then." Walt only smiled, assuaged by the good feelings of the day, even though those around him could see that he was growing tired, now worn out by simple outings. By this point, Walt inexplicably had begun to lose weight. His jacket hung loose, his face appeared thinner, almost gaunt. He was experiencing pain around his neck and shoulder, the after effects of an old polo injury. Cracked vertebrae that had calcified and now squeezed nerve endings. The pain was so serious and constant that his family doctor convinced him to consult a specialist. At his first appointment, the specialist suggested back surgery to lessen his discomfort. To guide the operation, Walt needed to complete a series of diagnostic procedures, including X-rays. Their results revealed a far more disturbing ailment than the injured vertebra. Doctors found large spots on his left lung, strongly suggesting the presence of cancer. This newly identified condition immediately took precedence over his upper back pain. From this moment forward, Lillian knew that Walt likely had cancer, as did his daughters and Roy, but beyond that, most studio employees were unaware of Walt's condition, still believing that he suffered from an old injury, but some close to him, noticing a new tiredness and preoccupation, sensed that Walt's condition had changed for the worse. Producer Harry Teitel explained, "We did all know he was ill." Animator Ward Kimball recalled, "He was broken down physically, trying to do everything his increasing responsibilities demanded." Either late in October or early in November, Peter Ellenshaw, longtime Disney matte painter, expressed concern about Walt's pending condition, as the old maestro now looked both anxious and thin. After Ellenshaw stared at him for a few seconds, Walt said about his upcoming hospital visit, "I'm not going over there to die." At the end of October, the studio created a press release using information that had been accurate the previous week, explaining Walt's condition was not serious. Paraphrasing the release, the Los Angeles Times reported, "Disney was troubled by an old injury which the 64-year-old executive had received while playing polo. A hospital official said only that Disney was undergoing diagnostic tests." After the troubling X-rays, this information was no longer accurate. Still, the studio decided not to change or update it, perhaps because such dire news about the man who oversaw Walt Disney Productions could send the stock price into a tailspin. Walt was admitted to St. Joseph's on November 7th, a hospital directly across the street from the studio. A surgical team led by pulmonary specialist Bert Cotton found cancer in Walt's left lung, a tumor large enough to require the removal of significant lung tissue. When the surgery was over, Dr. Cotton told Walt's family that the cancer had already spread to other parts of his body. Rather optimistically, he said, "I give him 6 months to 2 years." He also explained that Walt would remain in the hospital for a couple of weeks, if not longer. The surgical team suggested that it would be possible for Walt to partially return to work after he recovered, but almost surely he would never again have the strength to lead the studio as he had for the past 40 years. From his third-floor room, while recovering, Walt could look out over the Disney lot. He could see the animation building, the outdoor set where the Zorro series had been shot, and the residential street that had been used in a dozen Disney projects. As he sat there, his eyes were drawn to the water tower, which rose like an icon above everything else. It hadn't been painted in years, its color had faded, and its appearance was dull. Walt called Dick Failer, head of studio operations. "Dick, that water tower looks like hell. Why don't you get it painted?" Typically, Failer would have sent a project of this size out to bid to minimize costs, but instead he found painters who could start immediately. The project was finished in 2 or 3 days, creating a small beacon of renewal that Walt could observe from his hospital room. The one bit of hope Walt clung to during these dim days was this. He knew other Hollywood celebrities who had similar surgeries for smoking-related cancer, some of whom led productive lives. Among them were Nat King Cole, who 3 years earlier had visited Disneyland with his son, and the actor John Wayne. Wayne, whose lung had been removed in 1964, sent Walt a telegram to encourage him during recovery. "Welcome to the club," he said. He also explained that his largest inconvenience now was visiting places of high altitude as his remaining lung couldn't take in enough oxygen. But other than this, his note suggested he had recovered to live a full life. Walt carried that telegram, his son-in-law Ron Miller explained. That really meant a lot to him. It really did. 2 weeks after entering the hospital, on November 21st, Walt left it, largely to visit his studio. By this point, word was getting around that Walt had cancer, though studio officials hadn't yet confirmed this for employees or for the public. Animator Art Stevens recalled, "We all watched him walking around the studio, which was one of the saddest sights I can imagine." Harry Teitel remembered seeing Walt move through the halls of the studio. Those employees he met were glad to see him back on his feet and told him so. Walt took the words graciously at first, but after a while became irritable. He glanced over at me and said, "You'd think I was going to die or something." Walt spent time individually with a few longtime employees. In private conversations with Winston Hibbler, Walt confided, "I never had this kind of thing before, this surgery, but I'm okay. I may be a little off my feed for a while. You maybe got to carry on here, but I'll be around. At lunch, he saw Dick Irvine and Joe Fowler and asked them both about projects for Disneyland. "We were working on the Pirates ride at the time," Irvine explained, "and I said that we had one of the scenes pretty well programmed, the auction scene, for him ready to see." "Well, why don't you take me over now?" Walt replied. Irvine drove him from the studio over to WED in Glendale. On the way, they discussed the proposed entrance for New Tomorrowland, also murals developed by concept artist Mary Blair that would line the walkway. Even though Walt was clearly tired, he looked at one of the current WED projects, an update to the Rocket to the Moon attraction, which was being remade for New Tomorrowland as Flight to the Moon, incorporating advances in space travel made by the Apollo program. The stage he reviewed presented a pre-show discussion between animatronic spaceflight engineers and a live Disneyland host. Walt considered the show, its pacing and level of humor, but felt that the live host, presumably a woman, should have a larger part in the presentation. "We have to throw some lines to the live girl there," Walt suggested, "so that she can ask the questions and let the audience participate through her into the pre-show." From there, Irvine led Walt to briefly meet with key people, most of whom had offices in a single hallway at the front of the building. Irvine took Walt to meet John Hench, then Mark Davis. If people over at the studio held out hope that Walt might recover, those at WED, after seeing their old boss, quickly surmised the truth of the situation. He was dying. In Davis's room, Walt looked over sketches, some of which were for a bear band attraction Walt wanted to build at his Mineral King ski resort. In the drawings, a few bears were arranged like a marching band, one playing a clarinet, another a tuba, animatronic figures that could be arranged into a stage show. The concept at this point was extremely loose, something to entertain guests at night after a day of skiing or hiking, bears who supposedly came down out of the California Sierras to play instruments. "He sat down in my room at WED for a while," Davis said, "but he looked awful." Walt moved from one drawing to the next. "He chuckled over this group of drawings," Davis recalled, but then he stood up, looking worn out, and walked to the door. Turning back, he said, "Goodbye, Mark." Goodbye was not a term Walt regularly used, but hearing it now, Davis could feel its sense of finality in his gut, the suggestion that Walt might be departing the hallways of WED for good. During these same moments down the hall, another story was playing out in Ryman's office. As Walt approached Davis's office, Ryman had seen Walt for the first time in weeks. "Walt walked by," Ryman explained, "and I just could see out of the periphery vision. I could see that he was smaller and slower and hunched over." Ryman had not expected this, the complete transformation of his old friend and boss, someone who, like his mother 3 years ago, was close to death. "And then in these thin walls, what separated us, I couldn't hear his voice," Ryman continued. "I couldn't hear him speak. And I know that he was very weak because he had just come out of the hospital." And then Ryman understood the weight of this moment exactly as had Davis. "He had come up to tell us goodbye," Ryman said. With that, Ryman didn't know what to do, nor did he know if he could manage seeing Walt like this. "I began to think I can't go in there, because I can't go and look at a sick man and say, 'You look fine.' I can't lie, and you couldn't lie to Walt anyway. I didn't want Walt to see it in my face, his death, so I decided to stay away." As Ryman did not immediately come out of his office, John Hench went down to see what kind of shape Ryman was in. Though Hench had been upset by Walt's appearance, his belief in Buddhism allowed him to see death as a continuum in which a person's spirit continued to exist. But Ryman had no deep underlying faith. For Ryman, death was nothing more than loss, an essential piece of his life falling away. First his father, then Irving Thalberg, then his mother. At this moment, it was too much, the sense that even his life at WED would change, one of the last things that was still important to him. Hench leaned over my chair, Ryman recalled, and he said, "Walt's in the next room. Herbie, don't you think that you should come in and see him?" But Ryman didn't know what to do. Would seeing Walt solidify the finality of the moment? Would the combination of his mother's death, followed by what looked to be Walt's inevitable demise, prove too much for Ryman to accept? Or did Ryman sense that with Walt's passing, all of the wonders of WED, the great expanse of this artistic playground, this place where he had finally found a home, fade away as well, just as MGM changed after Thalberg's death? So Ryman just sat there, calcified at his desk, unable to stand up. For whatever the reason, he said, "Well, John, I'll have to be the one who decides that. Right now, I don't think I can." but he felt the heaviness of the moment, the finality of it. Already he knew that this was a day that would divide his life, like the day he learned his father had died on the battlefield. There were all those days that wed before November 21st, 1966, and there would be a different set of days after it. Ryman sat there. He was making an exchange. He would never fully see what cancer and the surgery had done to Walt, how close he was to death. In Ryman's mind, Walt would remain a slightly younger man, ailing but still full of life. But Ryman would never have the opportunity to tell his friend what he had meant to him. From the days in South America to the experience of building Disneyland, that sense of unexpressed gratitude would rest inside of him like a stone for years. "So I did not see Walt," Ryman said. "I did not shake hands. I did not say goodbye." But he heard Walt's footsteps, soft. Now, as he moved down the hall, he heard Walt's raspy breathing. He likely heard a familiar, if muted, cough. As Walt moved beside Dick Irvine, the man who would drive him one last time back to the studio, while Ryman drove to Van Nuys, where he now lived in a large house by himself. I'll be back next week with a new episode. And to keep the good feelings of the season going, I'll also post up another seasonal episode about the winter holidays later this week. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes, but the best reason to join us on Bandcamp is to support the work we do here and to make sure this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly Bandcamp supporter at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.